I'm Jasmine. I am the data platform lead from Clover Health. And I'm here to tell you a story today of how the philosophies and operations of Clover Health's data teams were shaped by the open source system. But first, I'm going to tell you a story about science, because I like science and using science for metaphors. And I like metaphors, and I especially like to use them in a presentation. All right, so Darwin in 1862 discovered this very unusual orchid in Madagascar, also known as the Star of Bethlehem orchid. This orchid has this really deep funnel for its nectar reservoir, and upon discovering this orchid, Darwin was immediately speculated that there must be some insect that's the counterpart of this flower that can actually feed into its very long tube. And sure enough, 20 years after his death, this creature called the Darwin moth, well, named after Darwin, was discovered in 1903. But it wasn't actually until another 140 years later that we captured evidence of this moth feeding from the orchid, because this moth actually only comes out at night, and we had to invent night vision before that. So Darwin had predicted that these creatures had co-evolved just based on the shape of their existence an entire century before, much earlier than we were able to directly observe. So that's what coevolution means, right? It's this intimate relationship between two organisms that quite literally and physically shaped who they are. So that's the metaphor part. That's the metaphor I'm gonna keep pitching today. But I kind of think of our teams as like this cool Darwin moths that have evolved with the orchids being the open source software. Open source software didn't just give us velocity, but it gave us energy and a wealth of new ideas that shaped the core philosophies of how we work. What does that actually mean? It's been a bunch of abstractions so far, but don't worry, I will go into examples in a second. But if you take nothing away from my talk today, just remember that science is cool and that something about a metaphor. All right. So before that, I want to give you a quick introduction of Clover and why we even care about data. We are a health insurance company, which is not normally what you first think of when you think of data tech companies. But we want to use data and technology to improve the experience and the health outcomes of our members. So when you think about the healthcare system today, it's really, to put it mildly, if you have ever gone through it, a character building exercise. Insurance companies sit at the center of so many transactions, but very few of them actually are able to leverage efficient technology and use that data for their benefit. And it also has a lot to do with their organization structure. So we want to not just improve the efficiency of that experience through tech, but we also want to use the data that we get to improve their health outcomes by using data science to identify gaps and making predictions and progressions on their conditions. The whole point is to use data and software to enable better decisions. And we couldn't do it without open source. It's kind of a key part of every link of this equation. Not just for the fact that it comes with so much software that we will have to write and recreate otherwise, but for the fact, like that metaphor that I'm going to keep pitching, it gives us a lot of ideas. And I'm going to give you some examples now. And I want to give you a disclaimer first, because I'm closer to the software engineering side of data. So a lot of my examples are going to be more focused on the data engineering side of data science. Okay, now let me tell you a story of how we got here. In January 2015, we were this newly formed tech team with just 4 or 5 people. We were like, we gotta do something with the data that we're getting. And as all companies that deal with data and analyze it know, that a big part of the battle is to load, clean, and transform it. And we were a very small team back then, so we wanted to outsource that part, or we thought we could outsource that part. So like many of the places, we did our due diligence of many of these like ETL tools out there with less than glamorous user interfaces. You're probably very familiar with those. And well, eventually, with a lot of reluctance and skepticism, we settled on one of them. So unfortunately, though, this decision quickly proved to be very, very frustrating, because many of our engineers actually write production systems from scratch, and asking them to deal with a UI that was trying to be programmatic was both kind of a nightmare and kind of like a joke. You would just be peering into these boxes, trying to rearrange them. It's a black box that was clunky, not flexible. You couldn't open it up to understand what it's doing. And the worst part was the software was actually really bad, and it froze really often, crashed on us, and we only had a limited set of licenses. So we decided, you know, we're gonna just start from scratch, and we're gonna commit the cardinal sin of just writing a bunch of Python and SQL scripts and orchestrate it by hand for a while eating breakfast. And then we moved on to cron. Good old cron. This was okay for a while, but it also proved very quickly to be an unruly solution, obviously, because it lacks of the basic functionality of an ETL system. Doesn't have visibility, doesn't have dependency management, metadata tracking, notifications. So a sequential execution of scripts really only makes you happy for so long until it fails silently all the time and you feel stabbed in the back. So we live with this for a while, enduring this pain for business impact while we figure out our next moves. Meanwhile, a whole storm of new zeitgeist was brewing all around us. So like the presentation before me, this universe of big data processing, tools, and data science ecosystem was really opening up and surging, and a lot of workflow engines were also popping up. And among them was Airflow. So that was actually referenced in the presentation before me. Developed at Airbnb by Maxine, who was formerly an engineer at Facebook. Airflow actually came out of an internal tool at Facebook called Data Swarm, and much similar to Dask, which you saw in the presentation before. With Airflow, you can easily write code, but you can also use a configuration-driven approach to develop pipelines. And much of the basic ETL functionalities came out of the box. So in November 2015, we officially picked Airflow as the orchestrator of our pipelines, but it's worth noting that there's many similar counterparts, like Luigi by Spotify, Pinball by Pinterest, and Dask, which unfortunately came out after we have picked Airflow. So for those of you who are not familiar with Airflow, I'm gonna give you a short introduction so you know what I am talking about later. It's very similar to the traditional concept of a scheduler. It comes with a lot of basic functionalities out of the box. You can define operators that are basically Python classes, and those are generic actions that you can then chain together to do repeated units of work. So what's cool about it for me is you can define the level of abstraction that you put into it. What does that actually mean? So you can write just an ad hoc Python script, schedule it to run it, but you can also write this really big framework where you can plug into through your declarative configuration-driven tasks. It definitely also comes with built-in notifications and rerun capabilities. For people who are familiar with web programming, I kind of think of it as the equivalent of Django or Ruby on Rails, but in the data stack. It's kind of sitting in the middle, making your data processing abstractions much easier. So using an open source tool, sometimes the relationship can definitely be a bit of a pioneering adventure. You are kind of like a guinea pig sometimes. But Airflow is quite young, so in a strong sense, we really grew up with it. We are involved in the community, and it's been a very accelerating experience for our team. So I want to show you some examples of what I mean by this configuration-driven approach. Actually, before that, this blog post recently came out by Maxime, the engineer at Airbnb, who wrote most of Airflow, and he explains why the traditional drag and drop ETL tools just don't work anymore. And this is by far my favorite quote from that post. Ultimately, code is the best abstraction there is for software. Code allows for arbitrary levels of abstractions, allows for all logical operations in a familiar way, integrates well with source control, is easy to version and to collaborate on. So not only is it the most flexible way to do any data processing work, but you can also target the abstraction that makes sense for you. So for example, a much needed abstraction in modern data environment is the configuration for experiments. in A/B testing framework. And those are often missing, right, in out-of-the-box ETL tools. So when we took Airflow, this is exactly what we ended up doing. It affected how we think about data processing in a major way. And we built a bunch of abstractions that were suitable for us. So I'm going to show you some examples. So one example is ingest. This is a YAML spec that is a declarative configuration of a file that we are ingesting. We have an ingest framework that ingest all kinds of different formats of files because unfortunately the standard healthcare API is files and SFTP, and we have to deal with a lot of different archaic data formats like HL7, copybook, data formats from banks. So instead of doing this in an ad hoc fashion, we were able to abstract it into a framework, which is basically a Python library that we run on Airflow. And this framework basically loads these specifications and then chain them dynamically together in a task, into tasks in Airflow, quite literally through a for loop. So I'll show you the code. It's quite literally a for loop, right? So there's something that loads all the specifications and then pass in the specification into a function that instantiates, based on that specification, a task that then gets picked up by Airflow and is runnable. And we're able to leverage exactly in the reverse direction of the logic that we wrote for serialization and deserialization into file exports. And so now you might be like, okay, what is the big deal? Don't traditional ETL tools actually also ingest and export files? The big deal is that we control the level of abstraction. We can put whatever we want into it, and we can compose small parts together. We can modify where we store it. So for example, for this, like we were able to extend it into loading into a lot of different places like S3, or Postgres, or Redshift. And by controlling the abstraction, we were also precisely able to do something that was, outlined in that blog post. We were able to construct an even higher level of abstraction, which is the campaigns that we wanted to run for various types of our member population. So that's a large part of what our data science team does at Clover, is basically identifying through signals what are some of the likely patterns of things like medication adherence. Is this member actually likely off their medication, and we need to send a reminder to them. So we need a very quick way to iterate through that so that data science can push their insights to our frontline staff who can then perform some sort of action to interact with our members. So how do we do things like that, where we can then easily group them into these time-limited outbound campaigns and track the success of the campaign in a control group? So now we have something that is very easy to stand up within like less than a day, that then can go end-to-end with an operational staff. So the funny thing is, the blog post that Maxime wrote actually only came out recently, but without meaning to, we pretty much found ourselves developing a lot of the similar abstractions that were alluded to in that post. So the beauty of this, to me, especially as an engineering manager, is not just about how we could scale our productivity easily, right? Because once you start being able to just plug in declarative specs, then you are able to develop it really, really quickly. It's also the part where the journey of that part between when you are just starting out to when you get to a fully fleshed abstraction. You could iterate really, really quickly as you learn to solve new problems. So you could start out with some custom code that's runnable but not generalized, because you could just put in Airflow and it will run it for you, and you still have all the benefits of notifications and visibility and things like that. And then you iterate and you start to abstract the problems. You layer on this configuration interface and specification for it. And that was a really, really cheap process for us, because we can write code that worked very quickly and ship out a lot of value quickly and not hold up the world and like think about what is this beautiful abstraction for 3 months. And then we eventually abstract it into something that scales really well. And as you notice, it's also a text-based interface. So we don't need to build UI in order to do that fast iteration. And if we do want to build some UI someday for our operational staff, we will also be much more confident that we actually have the right underlying abstraction for our problems. So as we did this, we had our data scientists and operations folks interact more and more with this ecosystem, directly writing a lot of spec files. And definitely for the data science folks, they actually collaborate very, very closely with us in the design exercise for new abstractions. They actually wrote a substantial part of the campaigns abstraction that I just showed you. But the interesting thing is for our operations folks, they needed to be technical enough to interact with the command line and write some spec files and run it locally to verify what's going on, and that's it. So without deliberately intending to do this as like an overarching strategy of what kind of people Clover is gonna hire for and what kind of company we're gonna be, we actually push everybody to be more technical. It wasn't something that we necessarily started out thinking that we were going to do because we had to hire a lot of folks from a traditional healthcare background. But we were able to teach them the basics of interacting with a much richer tool set. So like SQL, Python, command line, which are just much more powerful than your Excel and I guess your calculators or something like that. And this allowed us to move much faster, like as a company. And even though Airflow was my primary example of that, it's really not the only example. It just became a big signal to us of all of the things that are available in our tool set. We don't need something with a shiny UI for them to interact with. We can leverage something that's open in nature, and then we can co-develop it together. And and in that process, we kind of revisited what it actually means to be a technology company, especially in the health insurance space. Maybe what it means is not just that you have this tech team that can build robust software. Maybe what it actually means is that tech is permeated throughout the company. And it's not just us as a team building software for them, but that they are actually interacting with a much more advanced tool set and especially in their day-to-day life. So soon came the disruption of a different tool, which is all of our favorite software, Excel. So like in my introduction, I was actually an investment banking analyst in my former life, so I am intimately familiar with both the perils and the amazingness of the software. So that's me on the side bowing down to it. I still think that Excel is like the most amazing piece of software that was ever built, especially as somebody that went into software engineering later on in life. And it definitely led to a lot of GDP, even if we don't always know how much of it is real. So one day, our head of actuary came to talk to me about he needing to move our financial model out of Excel. So he had just recently discovered programming and was wielding his new power rather dangerously. So he says to me, "We need to build our financial model in Python." And I was like, no. It was terrifying to me. But after he explained himself, I found myself actually reluctantly agreeing with him and admitting that it kind of made sense. He explained like our most intricate and critical equations for the business, which are really, really complicated because they're insurance and he's an actuary, were in these like tiny grid cells, right? They are so tiny and you can't see the formulas of. It's very difficult to compose good software in this. And most of all, as like the thing that's most frightening to all software engineers, it is totally not tested. So when you think about it, that's like a really, really crazy way to work. So despite my misgivings and totally ignoring all of my fears and advice, they decided to just go ahead with it and write a simple tested Python script. But in the process, like their fearlessness actually got me to think about how, wow, we have a host of similar problems elsewhere. We have all these highly like analytical processes or pseudo-analytical processes that we want to move out of Excel, but we don't actually necessarily want it to be full-on Python software because the blank canvas can actually require a lot of technical proficiency to scaffold successfully. But you also want to leverage a much better tool set than what you have with Excel. So luckily, there is a whole ecosystem of tools just for that problem. So I'm super excited about leveraging Jupyter Notebooks at our company. So our data scientists obviously already use it for their ad hoc analysis, but I think this new possible use case is really, really interesting, where working in a data-driven premise insurance company is that data questions are actually everywhere. They are not just limited to data scientists. They are people like the actuaries, the finance team, the operations teams. They all want to be able to answer questions that can inform their day-to-day decisions. And we want to be able to take these pseudo-analytical processes that are trapped in Excel out into these transparent and automated processes that are much more powerful. So we're still in the early stages of experimenting with that. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of concrete examples to show, but we do have one project that's going on right now where every year we have to submit our planned benefit design to the government, which is a very rigorous analytical journey that requires you to analyze everything from membership, population characteristics, external pricing, and contracts. It's very, very complicated. And the traditional way of doing this is by saving basically 22 copies of the same Excel models, each version by their file name. And if you have to submit 100 plans, then the way that you do this is by hiring like 100 actuaries. Each of them have like 50 copies of Excel models, each with a meticulously versioned name on their computer. So that's obviously not how we want to do things. So we have people on my team right now that are working with actuaries closely, where they're doing this through a combination of Airflow configs and being plugged into notebooks and other Python command line interfaces as their UI. So the title of this talk, though, was Co-Evolving with Open Source, not just benefiting from it. So we have a commitment to the open source system, and we want to keep giving back to it. We want to influence it. We want to give it new energy and ways of thinking, not just how it has influenced us and what it has given us. And I wanted to talk briefly about some of the things we have open sourced or are in the midst of looking to open source. SQL Alchemy Temporal is a library that we built to deal with the robust auditing and tracking requirements of healthcare. Our ingest framework, which I referenced earlier on, it leverages S3 and can plug into different kinds of data sources and load into different destinations. And Turbine, which is a CLI tool to work with Airflow that can easily chain together some of the most common operations that you need to work with in a pipeline. So our ingestion framework is particularly exciting to me because it serves a lot of similar use cases for nonprofits and government agencies everywhere that deal with very archaic data formats. And I think it will have a lot of impact on traditional industries. So for me, it's very interesting to think about who we would have been without the influence of Airflow and the open source world. We definitely caught an interesting zeitgeist of the world around us, and we absorbed it fully into how we grow our team. I really believe that we would not be able to deliver on the premise of what we started without open source. And recently, we got into another debate at Clover about the future of business intelligence tools and whether we need drag and drop BI tools. The answer for me is I hope not, but in that process, our data product manager, who is this amazing person, who was also formerly a data scientist, had the most cogent argument that I ever encountered about why it made sense for us to think about teaching people to leverage tools that are more technical rather than building out fully fleshed out pre-built solutions. So I think this is so brilliant, so I'm just gonna read it out loud in its entirety. Do we make data accessible by moving the data closer to the humans or the humans closer to the data? Moving people towards the data has a few positive externalities, including the organization-wide ability to create faster, more programmatic output. If everyone across the company is writing little programs to do more work faster and more consistently, we're making good on the premise of Clover as a business that leverages technology across that work. And that's what I am really, really excited about. Not just building software for other people, but this iterative feedback loop between people, technology, and the ever greater impact that we have on the world. All right, thank you.
Thanks very much, Jasmine. We do have time for a few questions. Is there anybody that would like to pose a question for Jasmine? I see one in the back there. Do we have that the other mic on?
Is this thing working? Okay, so my question. Is this working? This isn't. What's the biggest impediment to executing what you just showed us?
So the question was, what's the biggest impediment to what you've just showed us?
That's a really good question. I think it is software building. It is trying to design an airplane while you fly it. Except now you also have... Is it actually working? It's going in and out a little bit. Yeah, so I was saying it's like designing an airplane while you're flying it, except now you're not just dealing with software, but you're also dealing with organization structure and hiring and people and education. So a lot of that alignment is like a constant repetition of your, not just your values as a company, but educating the people about what airflow means, because we have a lot of people that are in our company that are not super technical. So I find that by far the most challenging part, because it's not just trying to align my team about what kind of software they're going to build. I'm also trying to educate people outside of my team about buying into this new way of working.
Any other questions?
Very easy question for you, but how many people work at Clover, or approximately? Approximately how many?
It's currently 500 overall, but it's 90 in the tech team, and we have 50 engineers and 20 data scientists, and the rest are product managers and designers.
Thank you. Maybe one last question.
Hi, my name is Amit. My question is, how easy it is to move from investment banking or finance kind of role to insurance or health insurance?
That's okay.
It's definitely very doable. I think there are already a lot of the quantitative analytical skills in banking and other parts of finance that lend itself very naturally to software engineering. I think sometimes the mindset shift is more the culture rather than the technical skills. But there's a lot of people doing it now, especially through all of the coding boot camps.